There's a place in England where the gates are locked, the windows are barred, and the silence feels suffocating. A place that looks like a castle but functions like a cage, where killers and criminals are diagnosed, medicated, and hidden away from the world. This is not just any hospital. This is Broadmoor, a psychiatric institution so infamous it became a national legend. It was built to protect the public, but the deeper you go, the more you realize it was also a place where people were buried alive. Because once you entered Broadmoor, there was no certainty you'd ever leave. And the things that happened behind those red brick walls were far darker than most people will ever know. Before we unravel the history that England tried to lock away, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts below, and subscribe to Mystery Junky for more stories they don't want you to hear. Broadmoor opened in 1863, designed in the wake of rising fear. Not fear of war, not fear of disease, but fear of madness. Victorian England was deeply superstitious when it came to mental illness. To be mentally ill in the 1800s meant you were either ignored or imprisoned. But Broadmoor was something new, an asylum for the criminally insane, a high-security psychiatric facility for those who had committed violent crimes but were deemed unfit to stand trial. Its first patients included men who had murdered wives, strangers, and even royalty. The idea was revolutionary. Treat them, not punish them. But the building itself said otherwise. Built like a prison, reinforced with watchtowers, gates, and guards. It was a hospital by name, but a fortress by design. And that tension between care and control would haunt Broadmoor for the next 150 years. As the years passed, Broadmoor became home to the names that dominated newspaper headlines. People the public feared, the press sensationalized, and the justice system didn't know how to handle. Among them, Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, who murdered at least 13 women in a spree of violence that paralyzed the UK in the late 70s. Charles Bronson, one of the most notorious prisoners in Britain, sent to Broadmoor for his violence and uncontrollable behavior. Ronnie Kray, half of the infamous Kray twins, East End gangsters who ran London's criminal underworld in the 1960s. Broadmoor also housed Edward Oxford, who attempted to assassinate Queen Victoria, and scores of others, some psychotic, some misdiagnosed, and some who may have been perfectly sane but inconvenient. Inside Broadmoor, the rules of justice didn't apply. Once labeled criminally insane, you entered a legal twilight zone, a place where you could be held indefinitely with no trial, no appeal, no hope. Broadmoor's treatment methods evolved, but not always for the better. In the early days, treatment meant isolation, straitjackets, and prayer. By the mid-20th century, it meant electroconvulsive therapy, chemical restraint, and in some cases, lobotomies. Some patients were pumped with sedatives to keep them docile. Others were locked in rooms for weeks at a time. There were stories of patients restrained for hours, even days. Nurses overwhelmed, undertrained, and afraid of the very people they were supposed to heal. And the system's response? Not more help, but more silence. Broadmoor became a place of forgotten people. Not just the violent or dangerous, but the abandoned. People who had nowhere else to go, who had been failed by the state, the courts, and their families. It became a dumping ground for the unwanted. For most of its history, Broadmoor was untouchable. The public didn't ask questions. They just assumed the worst people were locked away and forgotten. But behind the scenes, a storm was brewing. There were leaks, stories of staff abusing patients, of sexual misconduct, of patients harming one another while staff turned away. In 1952, a convicted killer named John Straffen escaped Broadmoor. He murdered again, and the country exploded with outrage. It was a moment that shattered the illusion that Broadmoor was secure. And the scandals didn't stop there. By the 1980s, investigative reporters and whistleblowers started exposing the rot inside. Nurses spoke out about violence and mismanagement. Families demanded justice for patients who had died under suspicious circumstances. But nothing changed fast enough. Because Broadmoor wasn't just a hospital, it was a government liability. Too much change would mean admitting too much had gone wrong. In the 2000s, Broadmoor was rebranded. modernized with new facilities and updated treatments. The NHS took over, the buildings were rebuilt, and a shiny, high-security wing was constructed to house the most dangerous patients. They added cameras, more trained staff, updated policies. But many say the culture remained the same. Patients still faced long periods of solitary confinement. Mental illness was still criminalized, and the public still saw the hospital not as a place of healing, but as a place where monsters were caged. The name Broadmoor still echoed with fear. Even those who worked there admitted something about the place felt cursed, like it was built on suffering, and that energy still lingers in the walls. Broadmoor isn't just England's most notorious hospital. It's a mirror held up to society's most uncomfortable truths. What do we do with those we fear? How do we treat those we don't understand? And what happens when we stop seeing people as patients and start seeing them as threats? Broadmoor was built with good intentions, but it became a warehouse for trauma, a silo for social failure. Because at its core, Broadmoor represents the intersection of crime, mental illness, and public panic. When someone commits a horrible act, society wants answers. If they're sick, do we treat them? If they're dangerous, do we isolate them forever? There are no easy answers. And that's what makes Broadmoor so terrifying. It's a place where the line between madness and evil blurs, where people are judged not for what they did, but for what they might do again. And once that label is stamped criminally insane, it sticks like a scar. Some of Broadmoor's patients healed. Some never stood a chance. And some, we may never know whether they were monsters or made into monsters by the system itself. In recent years, mental health awareness has grown, but the stigma remains. We still fear the unpredictable. We still avoid the unstable. And we still build walls instead of bridges. Broadmoor isn't just a hospital. It's a relic. A reminder of what happens when medicine, fear, and control collide. And the worst part, it's not ancient history. It's still happening. Across the world, there are institutions just like Broadmoor, still locking away the misunderstood, still silencing the vulnerable, still choosing containment over compassion. So when we talk about Broadmoor, we're not just talking about a building. We're talking about how we treat the most broken among us, whether we give them a second chance or a life sentence dressed up as medical care. And that's the real dark history of Broadmoor. It didn't just house Britain's worst people. It reflected Britain's worst fears, and maybe still does. What makes Broadmoor terrifying isn't just who is kept inside. It's what the institution represents. A place designed not just to treat, but to remove people from society entirely. It became the final stop for people who didn't fit, who weren't understood, who weren't wanted. And while many of its patients committed terrible crimes, others were simply caught in a system that never gave them a chance. They were too violent for hospitals, too unwell for prison, so they were locked away somewhere in between. And that's the haunting reality. Broadmoor sits at the intersection of mental health, crime, and fear. And where those lines blur, compassion becomes difficult. We often think we're better now, that we've moved on from straitjackets and padded cells. But the truth is, society still fears what it doesn't understand. We still isolate those who break the rules of behavior. We still look the other way when institutions silence, sedate, and store the people we deem too dangerous. And that's why Broadmoor matters. Not because it's old, but because it's not as far in the past as we think. Its story is a warning about what happens when fear guides policy, when treatment becomes punishment, and when the walls we build to protect ourselves become tombs for others. So ask yourself, how many places like Broadmoor still exist today, just under different names? And how many people are still being locked away, not because they're evil, but because we don't know what else to do with them?